I'm Sam from Oxygen Tech, and today we're going to be talking about lists, indexing, and loops in Dart.
So here as usual we have dartpad.dev where we'll be doing our work today. So if you want to generate a new file, just click new, Dart snippet, this is what you'll get. I'm going to get rid of this for loop for now. And what we're going to talk about today are lists. We're going to talk about indexing in lists. We're going to talk about list operations. And we're going to talk about sublists. And then we'll move on to indexing in strings and loops. So for starters, a list. What is a list in Dart? It's a collection of objects. So if I say list, my list equals, so an empty pair of square brackets will just create an empty list. So as this is a list, and by default, its type is a list of dynamic objects, which means I can add an integer, a double, and a string to the list with no problem, and I don't get any errors. And you can specify what type of values you'd like in the list. So if I change this to string, you'd see that we get a couple of errors. So it doesn't accept an integer or a double value, it'll only accept this string. So by default, they're dynamic, but if you didn't state what type you'd like in there, and let's just make these into strings. So if you created one like this, and then you began working with a list, Dart would infer that this is a list of type string. So if you tried to add a different type of value to this list, it would not work. So let's create some data. So let's make a list of names. So Alex, Bob, Alice, oops. Make that a string. And just to be safe, I'll write the type here is string. We're gonna have a list of string objects. Okay. So first of all, let's print our list and see what we have. So print my list. So on the right hand side of the screen, we should just see the list come up in square brackets. There we go, everything's working well. So one helpful thing you can do with lists, I'm jumping ahead here to one of the list operations, but it just might be handy for us. So if you write list.length, you can get the length of a list. So we can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4 items in this list, so the list length should be 4. Okay. So now indexing. So indexing is taking the index of an item of a list. So lists are ordered and they are indexed. So let's say print my list. To get the index of an item, you use square brackets. So if I say print my list index 1, so it's going to print one of these names of index 1. So let's get rid of that. Let's see what we print here. Of index 1, you might assume it's going to be Sam, the first item, but we get Alex. So an important note in programming, indexes usually start at 0. So if you have a list of items, it'll start with 0 as the first item and then count up gradually from there. So in this list, 0 would be Sam, 1 would be Alex, 2 would be Bob, and 3 would be Alice. So just as an example, let's say 3. And we have Alice. So imagine you have a long list of items you're working with. If you want to get the last item in the list, it can be hard. You don't want to go through and have to count every item in the list and say, okay, this is the index of the item I want. We can use mylist.length -1. So the -1 is important because remember the length of this list was 4, but the index of the last item here would be 3 because we start with 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3. So let's print that. So this will get us the last item in the list, which again should be Alice. There we go. Okay, so that's basically how index works in lists. So just remember, starts at 0. Okay, so list operations. let's start with adding. So let's say my list dot add. I'm going to add a new name. Let's say Michael. And then let's print Michael added. And then just show my list to see the new state of the list. So first, let's print. We'll print my list in its original state. Original list, my list. So this $, this is called string interpolation. I've been over it in a past video. So if you want to include a variable in a string, you can use the $sign here. Okay, so let's run this and see. We should have the original list, and then we're adding one value to the list, which will be Michael. Let's see what happens here. So the original list should print Sam, Alex, Bob, Alice, as we specified it earlier. And then let's see what happens when we add Michael. Okay, so Michael has been added to the end of the list. So when you use the add operation with a list, it adds to the end. So that's add. So now another one, if you don't want to add them to the end of the list, if you want to add them at a specified index that is not the end, you can use insert. So let's say my list dot insert. No, now here you want to specify the index. So let's put the name at the start. So index of 0, remembering that the list starts at an index of 0 and goes up from there. And let's add Jennifer. So we print again. Jennifer added to start. So the start is index 0. My list. Okay. So it should print the same two lines and then another list where Jennifer has been added to the start using an insert. See, we've added her here. So we could change this if we want. Let's say we want to add her second in the list, which would be an index of 1. Let's run it again. And she should be added after Sam in the list. There we go. So she's added second there. All right. So next, let's say we want to remove someone from a list. So remove my list dot remove, let's say Sam. So you specify the value that you want removed. So I'll just quickly show you a variation. You can say remove at, and then just give it the index instead. So you could remove the name at this index rather than the name by value. But we're just going to remove by value today. Oops. Make sure we've got it right. Alright. Print Sam removed my list. And print again. Alright, there we go. Sam has been removed from the start of the list. Okay, and the last operation I want to show you is the shuffle. So this is just a fun one I thought I'd add. Well, fun for me. So if we say my list dot shuffle, all it does is randomly changes the order of the list. So let's just print my list one more time. So notice that this was the order: Jennifer, Alex, Bob, Alice, and Michael. And let's see what it prints now that we've shuffled the list. Okay, now it's Jennifer still at the start, then Michael, Bob, Alice, Alex. So it's changed the order of the list. Okay, now sublists. Let's just comment that out. So in Dart, you can create a sublist based off a list. Actually, I'm just going to delete this so we have a bit more room to play with. Okay, so let's say we want to make a new list of strings. So now the list is going to revert back to the original list before we added and removed and inserted people. So it's just going to be Sam, Alex, Bob, and Alice. So let's say my sub list equals my list dot sub list. So here we've got to specify first the index of where we want to start. So let's say we want the last 3 names. So from here we want, starting from index 1, we want 3 items. So let's put 1. So with this, rather than putting the index of the last value you want, you put the number after the index of the last value you want. So in this case, we've got 0, 1, 2, 3. The last one we want is index 3. So we have to put 4 in here, which kind of bothers me. It doesn't make sense to me, but this is how it is. So let's say print my sublist. Okay, so this should return from index 1, 2, and 3, and then you put the number after the last index you want. So that should return the last 3 items of this list. So a sublist can return a portion of a list. There we go. Alex, Bob, Alice. All right. So that's sublists. So indexing can also be applied to strings. So string indexing. Oops, let's comment that out. Oops. Okay, so let's say add a string title equals Dart developer. We want to print title, and we use the square brackets again to access the index. So let's just say 0, the first index of the string, and it should return uppercase D, like we have here. There we go, D. Perfect. So again, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, then 4 will be the space. The space is included in the index. And 5, 6. Let's try to get index 6, the first E, just to make sure this works. E, there we go. All right, and also we can do substrings, just like we can do sublists. So let's say string, let's just say lang, short for language, equals title dot substring, and we're going to start at index 0, and we want just Dart, just the first 4, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and remember we do the number after the final index we want, which will be 4 in this case, and then we print lang. This should just give us Dart. So let's print that to make sure it works. And we have Dart. Perfect. Okay, so just to show you another thing you can do, let's get rid of that. So accessing, let's say we want to say print my list of index, let's say 2. So that'd be Bob if we just printed that. Now here, this will be, so this item is now a string of the value Bob. And we can index again, so we can go deeper, add another one, and let's just say we want index 1. So this should return the second letter in Bob. So my list of index 2, 0, 1, 2, which is Bob, and then from Bob, index 1, which is 0, 1, we should get a lowercase o. So you can go a bit deeper with the indexing. And we get our O. Okay, so now that we've gone over lists, indexing and strings, I'd like to talk about loops. So we're going to keep this list we've made at the top. And now there are a few kinds of loops in Dart. So a loop is basically where you iterate through a number of items. So it works well with collections like lists. So we can go through each item in the list and perform an action. So the first most basic loop is a basic for loop. So this is the way it looks. You might have seen this when we generated a new Dart snippet here that comes up. So int I equals 0. So I'll just write this out and then I'll explain what everything means. I less than, let's say 10, I plus plus, and let's just print I, which is the index. So here what's happening is first we're declaring a new variable called I, which is the index of the loop. So the index will start at 0 in this instance. You can set that to whatever you want. So, and we've decided while I is less than 10, let's take this action. And then every time you take the action, you increment I by 1. So what's going to happen the first time, it's going to be, I is going to be 0. And it's going to print I, which will be 0. It'll say, okay, I is less than 10, because 0 is less than 10, so I'm going to print this. Yes, we'll print 0. And then it will increment by 1. So plus plus means incrementing by 1. So I will go up by 1. So it'll print 0, and then the value of I will be 1, and it'll go through this loop again. So now it'll say, okay, this is 1 now. 1 is still less than 10, so we're going to print 1, and then increment up to 2. So it'll keep going through until this criteria is no longer true, when I is no longer less than 10. So it should print from 0 to 9. So let's run it and see what happens. So here we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Perfect. So it runs as we want it to. So let's just change this a bit and say hello. And again, we can use string interpolation to access the variable of I, which is the index. So say hello I, and it should print hello 0, hello 1, etc. Okay. All right, now some other things we can do just to modify this. Let's set the initial index to 10. And let's say while 10, well, the index is greater than 0, let's decrement rather than increment. So it should count down from 10 to 1. Because when I hits 0, it will not print, because that criteria will be no longer true. So you can, oops. So the mistake I've made here is I've just printed 1 instead of the index. So 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Okay, so how are we going to use this for our list? So let's set the index to 0 and say while the index is less than my list dot length, we will increment. So it'll start at index 0, which in this case will be Sam, and for every loop it'll increment by 1 until I is equal to my list.length. So we will print my list I. So my list of index 0 should be the first one that comes up as Sam, and it'll go through the list until it's printed all 4 items. So that's how a basic for loop works. Okay, now another one is a for in loop, so for in. So if we say, rather than writing out all this, creating a new variable to monitor the index, with a list we can simply write for name, so string name in my list, print name. So that kind of reads a bit better. It makes a little bit more sense. We don't have the granularity of playing with the index here, but it should print every name in the list. So it's printed every name here twice, because I forgot to comment out this. Now let's run it again. It should just print every name once. So for every name in the list. So what we do here is create a new variable called name, which is an item for each value in the list. So name will be Sam, Alex, Bob, and then Alice. So for every item in the list, it will print the name. There we go. So that's a for in loop. And another type of loop is a while loop. So while, so this is how you can create an infinite loop in your computer if you'd like to crash your computer. So if you just said while true, perform some operation. So just print, you cannot stop me. So I'm not going to run this, but true is always true. So that would just continue to run. So let's say, what we'll do here is we'll create a variable for a counter. So this will act as the index. So this will just keep track of how many times we run this loop. So while counter is less than 10, print, you can stop me. And then we increment counter by 1. So let's run that and see what we get. You can stop me. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So counter started at 0 and it incremented all the way up to 9 before it stopped because this was no longer true. Counter was no longer less than 10. And the last type of loop, it's very similar to a while loop, but it's called a do while loop. So do take some action. So let's say print hello while some condition is true. So here I just want to show you the difference between a do while and a while loop. The easiest way to do that is to say not true. So not true will always be false because we know true is true. So if we change this while loop up here to not true, don't need the counter anymore. So we're getting an error here because this is dead code, because that is always false, so it won't print at all. But we don't get an error on the do while loop, and that is because it performs the action before checking whether this is true. So the while loop, it'll check if this is true, and then it'll do the action if it is. The do while loop, it performs the action once first, and then it checks if it's true. So it should just print hello once because it'll go through this loop once and then it'll say, oh, hey, true is not false. So we're going to stop there. So that's just a small variation of a while loop to see if you definitely want it to perform one iteration before it stops. So having learned this stuff, let's apply it. So we are going to say for int index equals 0 while the index is less than my list dot length I plus plus, we will iterate. So what we're going to do is say if my list of this index, the first letter of each word is equal to, let's say, A. Print my list of this index. So this is just a simple search function. All we're doing is taking the letter of A and it's going to search through this list, and any word that starts with A, it will print. So what we're saying here is we're making this new variable for the index. As long as the index is less than the length of the list, it will continue to increment through the list. So if my list of this index, so first it will check index to 0 because we've set the index to 0, and the index of that string again is 0, so it'll say, okay, we're looking at Sam, and then it'll say, okay, index 0 of Sam is S. Is that equal to A? No. It'll skip through here because that is false, and it will come to the next word. So it'll check Alex. So it'll say now the index is 1. Yes, the index is smaller than the length of the list, so we're going to continue to perform actions. So if my list 1, which is Alex, of index 0 of that word, which is A, is equal to A, it will print that word. So let's just see what happens. You should be able to anticipate what's going to happen here, but let's see if our search function works. So there we go, we've got Alex and Alice. We've returned the 2 words that meet the criteria of starting with A. So in a more dynamic app, you would accept user input and they could type in what they'd like to search, but here we've just hard-coded A to simplify things. So that's about all I wanted to go over today. In my next video, I think I'm going to have a look at functions. So we've been using functions all along. This is a main function. So you can create functions which are snippets of code that can be reused in your code time and time again. And we'll discuss that next time. So today we've spoken about lists and indexing and loops, and I hope you've enjoyed it.